carts carrying goods, supplies, women, children, that reinforces this notion that entire populations were moving, that this wasn't just, you know, pirates raiding cities on the periphery, but actually a full-scale invasion. When we look at the depictions of these sea peoples themselves, we actually see a tremendous number of parallels. And again, as I mentioned, the Egyptians are very good at, you know, sort of objectifying foreigners, taking the attributes of them that's most foreign and then using that to depict them. So we see parallels between the depictions of these sea peoples and see connections, right, with the depictions at Cyprus, right, at Enkomi, for example, here, with this chariotry, and more specifically, actually with the archaeological evidence that we have from Greece and from Cyprus itself. It appears that most of these individuals are escaping the collapse of the Mycenaean palace system, right? Pylos goes down, Mycenae collapses, and you see large-scale migration of peoples coming from the west and now settling in the east. So, for example, the archaeological evidence, this is armor that was actually found at Mycenae. You can compare it to the Egyptian depictions of these sea peoples, and the parallels are pretty much one-to-one, right? This plated armor with the flouse sides, boar tusk helmets, and now two swords, which are very different than the kind of weaponry used by the Hittites and by the Egyptians at this time. It's interesting too, these boar tusk helmets are mentioned by Homer in the Iliad, in addition to some of the armor and weaponry, even though Homer is writing, again, in the 7th or 8th centuries, you know, hundreds of years after these events took place. It's an oral tradition, and he gets a tremendous amount of it right. These boar tusk helmets, we do find them. And it puts things into perspective. At the end of the Iliad, those of you who are familiar with it, and the beginning of the Odyssey, there's a period known as the Nostoi, or the returns, in which Odysseus is trying to get back home. King Agamemnon is trying to get back home. And they end up in places like Egypt. They end up scattered across the globe. But the fact that Homer's writing about this diaspora, and we actually see evidence of it with these sea peoples, is quite interesting. Here's another depiction, a warrior vase from Mycenae. And we can look at the depiction of these warriors, right, again with their horned helmets, their round shields, and their spears, and then, right, the Egyptian depiction of the same group, again, different than the one that we saw before, right, with these feathered headdresses, but horned helmets, spears. Again, the parallels are very clear, and these very specific boats too. These sea peoples had these duck-shaped boats as well, differentiating them from the Egyptians as well. So very often, Ramses III in his depictions of Medinet Habu says that he actually defeated the sea peoples, because of course he's not going to say anything other than that, because he's an Egyptian king. But what he says is very strange. He says, oh, I defeated them and then I settled them in Sinai. I settled them in the southern Levant, pretty much where modern Gaza is today. And then we were good, you know, we just sort of, you know, they were fine and we were fine. Well, this is really not something that you would do if you were an Egyptian king. You wouldn't cut off all of your access to Asia by settling a hostile people there. So chances are Ramses II at best, or Ramses III at best, was able to broker a truce with these sea peoples, and a specific group of sea peoples known as the Pelset, or the Philistines, which we're going to look at right now. I should say too that this collapse of the late Bronze Age system often is sort of seen as, you know, the sea peoples coming in and raiding. Chances are, again, it's much more complex than that. For example, we know that during this time Hattusis was sending out all sorts of letters requesting grain. There appeared to be a massive famine in Hattusis. It's very telling too that at Ugarit, even though the city was destroyed and burned to the ground, not a single skeleton was actually found out of a burial context. So if we expect that a city is destroyed by an act of war, we're going to find people collapsed under buildings. We're going to find arrowheads stuck into bones, that sort of stuff. Nothing like that whatsoever. It seems that Ugarit was probably abandoned before it was sacked. Again, perhaps sacked by these sea peoples, but environmental change, famine, perhaps even a tsunami. There's some evidence linked to that. Earthquakes. Whatever is taking place during this time causes, again, widespread destruction across the Eastern Mediterranean and the collapse of this international system. Probably a combination of events, right? So these sea peoples actually coming from Greece, leaving their Mycenaean palaces, now seeking new resources, right, and settling now in the on the Levantine coast. Let's see. So we're going to talk about just jump over here. I got ahead of myself. We're going to talk about the Philistines particularly. The Philistines are a group of these sea peoples, and probably the best known of these tribes. Pelset is sort of the origin of the name of the Philistines. The word and the use of, we know the Philistines from a few sources, right? We know the Pelset from Egypt. The Philistines, of course, figure prominently in the Old Testament as the enemy of the tribes of Israel, right? Those of you who know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine. And they're depicted because of the fact that the only literary sources we have, really, they're enemies. They're depicted pretty poorly and given pretty bad reputation. Pelesh is also Hebrew for, it's a Hebrew word for divide or invade. There are also some thoughts that maybe the name Philistine comes from Greek, which is phile histia, which means tribe of the hearth. And we'll see that hearths play an important part in Philistine material culture. The high point of the Philistines occurs around the 11th century, and again, archaeologically, we believe they have Aegean origin. And again, the Aegean and mainland Greece, we see connections early on in the late Bronze Age. The Hittites, for example, were in touch with this group of people known as Akiawa, which sounds very much like Achaean, the word for Greece during this time. This kind of goes hand in hand again with proof that the Trojan War actually might have been based on some historical precedents. Biblical sources say the Philistines came from Crete. Regardless, we know that they did settle in Canaan at the beginning of the 12th century. And essentially they established what's known as the Philistine Pentapolis, a series of 5 cities, including Tel Mikne Ekron, Ashdod, Tel Safi Gath, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Most of these sites have been excavated, and the finds at sites like Ashkelon and at Ekron are probably our best examples. And what we find are some very specific indicators of Philistine culture. For one thing, the Philistines had a very specific type of pottery. It's known as bichrome pottery, often depicting stylized birds and these motifs that we see parallels with in prior periods in mainland Greece and in Cyprus. It seems that the Philistines first came to Cyprus and then made the transition over to the Levant. But of course, Philistine bichrome, as different as it is, pottery, as we've seen, doesn't mean that you have people coming. Just because you have texts that say people settled there and you see a new type of pottery, that doesn't mean that we're seeing new settlements, right? Pots can be traded. Pots are not people. So what are some of the other indicators of Philistine material culture? Well, for one, at sites like Ashkelon, we see new forms of architecture. We see installations such as large bathtubs that probably were used for dyeing wool. Again, we were talking about wool dyeing along the coast of the Mediterranean with Murex. So these large vats. We see installations for distilling alcohol, different types of loom weights that differ drastically from those that were used in Canaan during this time, and loom weights that seem to be similar to those used in mainland Greece. The buildings themselves, this is some of the domestic architecture from the city of Ashkelon. And you can see here we have these platforms, and inside them centralized hearths, these hearths that are covered with sherds, potsherds, and then surrounded by pebbles, possibly, again, serving a ritual function. This is also at Ekron. There's a large building at Ekron with a similar construction, and at also other Philistine sites. Similar to what you find in inland Greece at a megaron, where hearths play a very prominent role. So what we're seeing is architecture that mimics, and while it's different, it's very similar to that which we see in mainland Greece. Not just that, the food that's being consumed at these sites is very different. There's a marked shift at sites like Ashkelon when you start doing statistical analysis of the food that's being consumed. So in the Canaanite period, dating to around 1300, mainly sheep and goats. That's the majority of the type of bones that you'll find being consumed. With the Philistines, at sites like Ashkelon, at Ekron, all of a sudden that number goes down and the consumption of pig goes way up. So we see that the daily activities and the foods being consumed here are very, very different. So all those things then, text, architecture, material culture, ritual activity. In fact, I could jump ahead here. We see new ritual activities such as the introduction of these little, very Mycenaean style figurines, very different than anything we've seen in the Middle East. This is called an Ashdoda figurine because we don't know her name. She's from the site of Ashdod, so again, she's called Ashdoda because we don't have her actual name. So again, text, architecture, material culture, ritual activity, daily practice, food, all of these things come together, and really that's what underlies, our evidence that we do actually have the migration and establishment of a new group of people here on the Levantine coast at this time. It's interesting though, as quickly and as different as the Philistines are, they adopt a number of Canaanite practices. This process, while the Egyptians depict it as a violent one, appears to have been much slower and much more of a hybridization of sorts. For example, in the late Bronze Age in Canaan, you would find ritual activity like bowl lamp deposits. So this is an example of a bowl lamp deposit. Essentially, it's exactly as it sounds. You take a bowl, you put a lamp inside that bowl, and then you cover it with another bowl. We've seen foundation deposits in the ancient Near East. This is similar, right? These were actually buried in the corners of buildings in the southern Levant. It's a very Canaanite practice. It's very specific to Canaan. What's interesting is that when the Philistines arrive, yes, they bring all these new things, these new rituals, types of architecture, but they actually adapt and adopt this process. They start using bowl lamp deposits. And within about